there are great suppliers and there's not so great suppliers. And if you're trying to get a source of truth, you really want to trust the people that you're working with. And that can be hard in a global economy where your raw material supplier isn't, based where you are. You've never met them in person, but it's important to develop that relationship.
Hello, and welcome to the Demystifying Cosmetic podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Cookson, R&D professional, industry veteran, and beauty enthusiast. Today, we will be talking about clean beauty with the Director of Science at Credo Beauty, Christina Ross. Credo, the largest clean beauty retail, has the highest standards in the industry with uncompromising commitment to transparency. Right. Christina oversees the Credo Clean Standard, restricted substance list, and fragrance transparency policy. Christina oversees brands, products, and ingredients for human health and environmental safety. A strategic thinker, Christina is a scientist and product steward focused on improving consumer product safety through the application of science-based approaches to an under-regulated industry. For over 10 years, she has worked with some of the largest multinational and independent personal care companies to assist them in bringing safer products to market. She is active in the advocacy and public outreach space to advance the science and policies for consumer products. Welcome to the pod, Christina.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm interested to hear, to start, what notable memories or experiences you may have had over your career that have shaped your opinion and advocacy in the industry.
Oh, that's a really good question. Prior to being at Credo, I was in the consulting industry for about 10 years, and I worked for a few different firms, primarily in product stewardship. So that's all sorts of consumer products, not just cosmetics. That was a very eye-opening experience. I learned so much about the difference between multinational brands and smaller brands. I was oftentimes on litigation support work or toxic tort litigation where there was a large number of plaintiffs suing for one thing or another. And that was a particularly eye-opening experience to participate in jury trials for both small and large companies that perhaps weren't doing best by the consumer.
Yeah. Okay. And so the Credo Clean Standard is available on the Credo website. So, I don't want to go too much in depth on that, but I am interested in hearing about what segments of the industry were important to consult with when you were creating the Credo Clean Standards.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the Credo Clean Standard tangibly is about a 30-page document that lives and breathes everything that we hold as standards in order to be sold at Credo. It was foundationally first a dirty list or restricted substances list, which isn't something that's unique to cosmetics. Many different industries have a list of ingredients that they restrict in use in their product assortment. Credo went one step further in creating our clean standard, where, again, from consulting background, I like to say it's really a consultant document for brands of best practices because we're an under-regulated industry. The cosmetics industry is under-regulated. It's tough for particularly the smaller indie brands to really know what they should be doing when they're making a product. And we don't want brands necessarily relying on just the formulator or just the contract manufacturer who has a certain picture of the cosmetics industry, but not a holistic view. So as a retailer, when we're seeing both what consumers want, we're working with formulators and cosmetic chemists, as well as contract manufacturers. And we're in the advocacy space doing a lot of regulatory work and policy change work. We wanted to create a document that provided all of this information for our brands. So it's about a 30-page document. There's 4 pillars: people, packaging, planet, and blanking here. Anyway, you can scratch that out. There's 4 pillars that are part of our Credo Clean Standard. And the baseline for creating that standard was really working and collaborating with industry professionals. So we had toxicologists, we had scientists, we had industry professionals, we had stakeholders from the retail realm, and we also worked with policymakers and NGOs as well. In order to inform our Credo Clean Standard. It was written prior to me joining Credo, and I'm responsible for its evolution and upkeep. And then our RSL, of course, was a proactive approach, primarily based on hazard, but also a bit of risk analysis or risk assessment as well. And I think we'll probably be getting into that more deeply in your questions.
And I guess, the industry, you've stated it, and I don't think it's something that is a misstatement, is underregulated. And in terms of that evolution that you're seeing with what has been established as the Credo Clean Beauty, are you seeing any trajectory towards more transparency or, greater oversight of the industry in most recent years? Let's say, for instance, SPF, there hasn't been, a SPF active that's been approved in 20 years. Generally,
Right.
the FDA is very slow, a little stagnant, but we are starting to see some positive trends in terms of MOCRA. And, from your perspective, do you see a lot of evolution happening in most recently in terms of what you're needing to do to help evolve that Credo Beauty standard?
Yeah, that's a great question. So just to set the stage, I know there's a lot of industry professionals listening, but in the US, the cosmetics industry is an $85 billion industry. And what's particularly interesting is that cosmetic ingredients can enter the market without any mandatory safety testing. So they're not only entering the market, but they're also entering our bodies and our homes and the environment. So first and foremost, there's still not any mandatory safety testing required for a new ingredient or chemical to be used in cosmetics. That's not unique to beauty, but we're speaking about beauty today. There's no agency verifying ingredients long-term or even short-term safety used in products. It's really the onus is on the brands. And MOCRA hasn't substantially changed that. So I've heard the notion that MOCRA is a floor and not a ceiling, and I definitely agree with that. We're certainly proud to have it passed and supported it, but it can go further. Safety substantiation is still in the rulemaking process for MOCRA, so it remains to be seen really what the full MOCRA package will do for the cosmetics industry. But in terms of transparency and moving the industry forward, it's certainly great. First and foremost, FDA now has recall authority. I think is a surprise to many people that are outside the industry that the FDA couldn't pull a product on the market prior to MOCRA. And as you mentioned, in general, regulations have been lagging. FDR was president last time there was a cosmetic regulation that was passed. So that was in the 30s. Things have really changed and evolved since then. So I think it's important to distinguish the difference between bottom line regulations that probably should have been part of the US legislative space for a long time versus what's best practice. And we are seeing these things that are more best practice, like transparency, really moving forward. And I'd like to say that's because of movements like the Clean Beauty movement, where we're asking the questions of the raw material suppliers and of the contract manufacturers. When a product is being formulated, we're telling our brands, and in our private label brands, we're asking the formulators and raw material suppliers and ourselves about the source of the ingredient, about the full fragrance disclosure. The questions like that are really typically a black box in the cosmetics industry. And so having more people in the clean beauty space and in the cosmetic space in general stand shoulder to shoulder and ask these questions of the industry only helps to improve the industry for everyone.
And digging into a little bit of industry shortcomings, you mentioned ingredient safety, not really having established safety protocols for either introducing new ingredients or the ingredients that have already been introduced. Can you expand a little bit more on where you think the industry is failing in terms of ingredient safety?
Yeah, I think it's creating globally recognized method for safety substantiation of a product. So there's hazard assessment, there's risk assessment, there's final product safety assessment. All of these are very important. And within all of those safety assessments, there's different tests or levers, so to speak, that you can pull in order to answer your questions. But there's really not a great methodology that everyone can follow that's digestible for the types of people who are typically making some of the beauty brands. Like we see a lot of celebrity brands or a lot of indie brands coming up to the market. The market has really changed over the last 50 years from a multinational to a lot of small brands. And I'm seeing a lot of lack of guidance. So they're typically relying on their raw material suppliers or their contract manufacturers to do what's best in the industry. And depending on who they are working with, they're getting different answers, different documentation, different test methods, so on. We have seen significant progress in the development of alternative test methods that can predict human health outcomes and environmental outcomes, which is incredible. So a lot of in vitro and in silico type of test methods, new approach methods is another term, which is incredible. We've been able to eliminate animal testing in so many ways, but there's still a need for broader acceptance and validation of these test methods. So a lot of the methods have been developed, but not necessarily validated or aren't commonly used. So we need to ensure that these test methods are both predictive, validated, and do a reality check. Can they be really used by the people who are manufacturing the products themselves?
Yeah, and I think when some criticism I've heard from even toxicologists is that when you're thinking of cosmetics, they're topically applied. So you're not looking at potential exposure routes such as oral or inhalation. And so where do we find that degree of comfort in the safety assessment we do, knowing that the exposure is relatively low in terms of how it could impact overall health for specific cosmetic and personal care ingredients?
Sure. Historically, toxicologists have focused, and this is a generalization, but focused on inhalation and ingestion as exposure routes. Dermal is a bit less studied, a bit less understood. And it's an important area of research because it is potentially low level of exposure, but over a lifetime, and I can think of one person who is using no consumer products or using just one or two. Even, the cosmetics industry tend to think about women, but men use so many cosmetic products too. They're just not necessarily marketed in the same way. So if you think about just the average person in the US getting ready for their day, they're using, I forget the exact statistic, but between, 5 to 10 products just to get out the door in the morning or just to go to bed at night. And so perhaps it's a low level of exposure, but it's chronic and it's over a lifetime. And there are a lot of synergistic effects that have been very understudied. So even though there are ingredients that have a strong or robust human health safety profile for the use level in the particular cosmetic, it remains to be seen how that can be extrapolated over many products for a lifetime. And final product safety assessments attempt to do that through the margin of safety calculation, but it's an understudied area, which again, men use these products too, but is not uncommon, right? When it's a women's issue or viewed as a women's issue to be understudied. So it's very important for us to understand the synergistic relationship of these ingredients or chemicals and products, as well as the long-term exposure.
Yeah. And what is the risk calculation that is made specifically by Credo and the Credo Clean Standards when we think about some of the potential ingredients on the dirty list? For example, what would you say to critics that believe skin cancer is a more significant risk than the potential harm of chemical sunscreens?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're bringing up sunscreen so much. It's one of my favorite topics.
It's one of the I think it's a very good and suitable example, but it's been the focus of a lot of attention as of recent.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's certainly a lot of misinformation. And it's important, and I'll underline here, that sunscreen is truly a public health issue because it prevents exposure to the sun, or prevents exposure to UV rays rather that cause skin cancer. So Credo, to answer your question, takes a proactive approach in evaluating ingredient safety, and we're looking at it both from a human health standpoint and also an environmental standpoint. There's many areas where I'd like to go further on our restricted substances list, but the industry just isn't there yet. There aren't great alternatives, or the alternatives that do exist have perhaps less data than the ingredients that are on the market. So we really want to make sure that we're not playing whack-a-mole where we are, substituting one bad actor with another bad actor ingredient on the market. So we're really diligent about making sure that our dirty list is something that is possible in the real world. Silicones is a great example. There's certainly some environmental concerns with certain silicones and some human health concerns with cyclic silicones, which we have prohibited. But those environmental concerns, while very important, there aren't great alternatives. And to have a functional product that people like to use is also important. We don't want to sell a product that's going to be returned or thrown out and end up in the landfill. So we view that silicones, while not perfect, are better to use than creating a product that isn't efficacious for every skin type or hair type. So we have a very holistic lens when creating the dirty list. It is grounded in hazard, which, we can go into the difference between hazard and risk if you think that's beneficial for your audience, but it's grounded in hazard. We then will take a risk approach when needed, a risk benefit approach, and then at times look at additional evolving data or emerging contamination data. So to answer your question specifically about sunscreens, I actually just created an email that we sent out to our customers last week about our stance on sunscreens. So Credo does prohibit all chemical sunscreens at this point. Sunscreens are interesting because they're regulated as an over-the-counter drug. So there's some more regulation there, and there is a large amount of data hurdle that brands, manufacturers, raw material suppliers have to meet in order to bring a sunscreen ingredient to the market. It's actually huge, so huge, in fact, that, as you said, there hasn't been a new ingredient in 20 plus years, which hopefully that may be changing. But the risk-benefit approach is incredibly important to look at. So although we prohibit chemical sunscreens now, we prohibit that because they're under evaluation by the FDA. So in 2019 and 2020, there were 2 studies that came out published by the FDA showing that certain chemical sunscreens were absorbed into the human bloodstream at a level higher than expected and at a level that was higher than the threshold FDA needs in order to determine it as GRAS or to not need additional data. So that threshold was met when the sunscreens were applied at maximum use level. And because of that, FDA is now requesting more clinical and non-clinical data on the chemical sunscreens. We are hoping that that data comes quickly. I have reason to believe that some of that data already exists that may be privately held. We would love to see that data become more publicly available so that we can start using more chemical sunscreens and encourage some more elegant formulations. Zinc and titanium dioxide we do allow, and those are kind of the physical blockers, which are great ingredients, but not always super fun to use and certainly not available for all skin types. So I'm going into a rabbit hole on sunscreens, but it's an important topic where I'd like to highlight that our dirty list isn't something that is set in stone, that once something is on that list, it is forever on that list. It's more of a list to indicate where we need more data. And that's something that is very important to me as an industry professional. In fact, Credo is a founding member of a collaborative called the Know Better, Do Better Collaborative. It's a pre-competitive collaborative with several other retailers, raw material suppliers, brands, NGOs. And basically, we're working to fill priority data gaps, specifically around hazard assessments. So just as some chemical sunscreens were waiting on more data, there's certainly a lot of natural ingredients where we'd like to see more data as well. We talked earlier about the lack of methodologies, botanical safety assessments, botanical hazard assessments certainly have a lacking methodology as well. There's a whole host of reasons that some natural ingredients are hard to approach from our typical toxicology equations, and we're working to solve that with the Know Better, Do Better collaborative, and then prioritize filling data gaps on naturals. So just as we are putting the hold on chemical sunscreens, we're also putting the hold on some naturals because there's just a lack of data. And again, we want to stand shoulder to shoulder and ask the questions and see where we can fill those data gaps.
Yeah, and going into kind of those gaps in safety, who are responsible for filling those? We can go back to the sunscreen example, and there are multiple suppliers of various chemical sunscreens, and I'm not quite sure if they were to conduct any of the evaluations that they would be unbiased. So then, who is it that becomes, or who should be responsible for evaluating the safety to ensure the exposure of consumers in the cosmetic industry?
Yeah, that's an incredible question, and something that I would like to be answered sooner than later by the industry as a whole. But under current regulation, as we talked about earlier, you don't have to meet any sort of data book. You don't have to provide data in order to bring a new ingredient or product to market. The onus is on the brand.
In the US, yeah.
In the US, thank you. And then the onus the buck can kind of get passed down to the raw material supplier. If a brand is being questioned about safety substantiation, they, well, my raw material supplier, this is the testing they did, or I relied on them. I would like to see a regulatory body help in the advancement of prioritizing what data needs to be created and how it's disseminated. And I would love to see it be publicly available and transparent for both manufacturers and brands, but also for the consumer. That's an idealistic world. I don't know if and when that would happen, but I do think that creating our current regulatory space in the US that has created the situation where chemicals and ingredients don't have to be pre-approved on the market is tough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There are good best practices and gold standards, but there isn't a global, system that everyone is using.
Yeah. And given that right now that onus is on the brands and sometimes raw material vendors, and understanding that smaller brands maybe work at a different level of sophistication than some of the larger conglomerates, how does the requiring standards outlined in Credo maybe impact the ability of smaller companies to either adhere to those rules or monetize safety and transparency, take that risk calculus of saying, I'm going to spend the cost to do this assay, if they're already operating under a relatively small budget?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly our testing requirements and our best practices and standards can add costs to product formulation and R&D, but that's a firm stance that we have. I talk to brands, I would say, on the weekly basis about our clean standard and, for instance, ocular testing. Which method should the brand use and why? And how many batches should they test? And all of these types of questions, of course, with the goal of making it realistic for brands while also making sure that the product is brought to market with the most data and safety behind it. I would say that these costs are an investment in safety and transparency, and they really are required by our industry in that you have to be able to substantiate your product safety before bringing it to market. But that language is so loose that everyone interprets it slightly differently. And at Credo, with our standard, we interpret it in a pretty strict way. And it's increasingly important to consumers to have this information and for brands to share this information. So I would say ingredient safety and transparency and sourcing even can go a long way to differentiate a brand in a crowded marketplace. So you can monetize with, talking about the work that you're doing. And it also goes a long way, certainly with MOCRA substantiation coming down the pipeline, while also, existing regulations requiring that a brand is able to substantiate safety. So, as an anecdotal example, if you are creating an eyeliner and haven't run ocular testing, you cannot say that you've substantiated your safety, even if your ingredient list is, adheres to our dirty list or adheres to any sort of restricted substances list.
Yeah. And I think, I'm curious to hear how you feel consumers, how they care about safety in an industry that is very vanity driven, right? Consumers will go to depths to alter their appearance, invasive methods. How much do they care about safety?
Yeah, it's a tough topic to generalize. We're certainly biased at Credo because we have a consumer that is likely more interested in the topic. But I say all the time, I would love for someone to walk into a Credo or any beauty retailer or Walgreens or wherever someone is buying their cosmetics and not have to think about it or not have to question it and not need a scientific degree to understand the industry or a particular ingredient. I believe a consumer should be able to go to any retailer or purchase a product from any brand and feel that it's safe, not only from themselves, but also for their family who might be a vulnerable population or young baby or otherwise. We're not there yet as an industry. So whether, you use the term clean beauty or not, I think having safer products on the market is important. I will say I've seen a lot of interest from the consumer from a sustainability standpoint, which is safety, but on the other hand, right, environmental safety. So there are a lot of cosmetic ingredients that aren't great for the environment, naturals included, where they can be aquatically toxic or bioaccumulate or be persistent in the environment. And I see a lot of consumers starting to be interested in that lens of their cosmetic product, not only from packaging, but even from the ingredients themselves that make up the cosmetic product. And I find that really energizing. It's important work, and there has been a lot of research, and we can only do more in that sense. Climate change is here. We're all contending with it. We're trying to do better. And consumer products are an important area to focus on. Not only cosmetics, but consumer products as a whole are important to look at from their environmental footprint. At the end of the day, we're selling a consumer product, so we can't say we're sustainable, but we can do better. Everyone's going to need a toothpaste or a sunscreen or a facial moisturizer. So how can we do, the best we can while also still providing what the consumer is looking for?
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. Things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucaps line by going to tagra.com/cellucaps. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
Yeah, and that's a good introduction to kind of that sustainability pillar that you discussed as part of being that holistic view on kind of the standards that are created. And in terms of, I think, future state, what does that look like? What do we think future state for something that is, even though, again, we are selling a product, right? So it's not in essence sustainable, but what is that future scenario of what it looks like in terms of packaging, in terms of ingredient sourcing? Where do you see the industry heading?
Yeah, there's a lot of different areas to look at. And, this could be a whole podcast in itself. Packaging is a big issue. Most recycling facilities can't accept or can't recycle things that are smaller than the size of a yogurt cup. So if you think about cosmetics, that's pretty much all of the packaging. So seeing how we can do better there is very important. Credo.
Is that I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with kind of recycling. Is that more of a cost analysis where they're like, it's so small, we need so many in order to create, enough resin? Why is it that they don't accept small plastic pieces?
Yeah, and it can be different based on locality. So it's important to look at your own, location. But typically the machinery isn't equipped to handle it. So they have filtering mechanisms, and anything smaller than a yogurt cup is filtered out. Whether they decided to create the machines that way because of cost, I don't know. But that is kind of across the board. And then there's pumps. Cosmetics are notorious for using a lot of pumps, which are not a monomaterial. They typically have a metal spring inside. So those, regardless of size, are filtered out because they're not a monomaterial. They're too difficult to recycle. And we can talk about Credo's, work in the pump industry if you're interested. But there are also caps and think of a toothpaste tube, which is also not monomaterial. They have been able to create a toothpaste tube that is now monomaterial. So in theory could be recycled, but the difficulty of cleaning out a toothpaste tube in order to make it not contaminate the recycling process makes it so that even a monomaterial toothpaste tube is filtered out through the system and not recycled. So it's a real headache. And that's something that we are working with industry experts all the time on how to develop our own sustainable packaging guidelines, which are embedded in our Clean Standard. So right now, we ask our brands use 50% recycled plastic or PCR, post-consumer recycled plastic, in their packaging. Not all brands are able to meet that for a whole host of reasons, specifically refillable brands. It can be tough to meet a 50% PCR plastic requirement because when you're using post-consumer plastic, sometimes it's not as hefty or can't be refilled as many times. And of course, plastic isn't circular, it can't be recycled over and over. But there are inherent safety issues with glass. It's expensive to ship glass. There are issues with aluminum or tin. So it's very much a piecemeal approach right now of what's best for the brand, and we need more data behind it. So to answer your question of where I see the industry going, first, we need more data, I think, even to be able to answer that. So there's something called a life cycle assessment, which is an important aspect to provide the full holistic picture of sustainability across a consumer product. And brands are starting to develop a life cycle assessment.
Sure. Yeah.
Data repository, which I think is incredible. So we need more data in that realm. Credo is going to be doing a few life cycle assessments this year on our own third-party brands. They're very expensive. It's a long haul, as is any data collection, right? It's not easy to do, which is why so many people don't do it.
And there's different metrics that you can use, right? In terms of land use, resource use, the carbon footprint. There's different metrics that you can measure that LCA on as well. That becomes complicated.
There's not a recognized methodology yet. So I think we need to be working in that direction. But in terms of the ingredients used in products, I would like to see more alternatives in a couple of areas. So one is avoiding at all costs using carcinogenic feedstocks for the beginning of chemical synthesis. So a lot of the ingredients themselves are inherently, clean, so to speak, or aren't concerning from a human health or environmental standpoint, but their feedstocks are quite concerning. And we see a lot of articles, they unfortunately happen yearly about, train derailments carrying vinyl chloride. And these feedstocks and chemicals are typically manufactured in fence-line communities where people of lower socioeconomic status are breathing in harmful, air quality because of the manufacture of these ingredients. So even though the end ingredient itself may be safe for a product, we need to think really the full supply chain and how we can do better. So we get a lot of questions on our ethoxylated ingredient policy, and we have a very firm stance that we don't allow a subset of ingredients that are manufactured through ethoxylation or the ethoxylation process. And all those ingredients, like SLES or otherwise, are, pretty darn safe for the final end-use consumer. The carcinogenic feedstock from the starting point is highly problematic.
Yeah, it has a larger impact.
So there's a lot to unpack there. Now, I would be remiss to say that the beauty industry is going to move the needle on any of these carcinogenic feedstocks because we're not the only industry using chemicals, right? Most industries do. So we need to evolve in all industries on how to use green chemistry approaches to manufacture better ingredients. And if we can get the consumer to care about cosmetics, can we get the consumer to care about car manufacturing or hospital equipment or sterilization processes, all of these things that use pretty nasty chemicals? TSCA, which is outside of the scope of this podcast, is a step in that direction. It's an EPA regulation to start getting more data on some of the prioritization chemicals, but we need to go further. So long spiel to say we need more data in order to decide how to best move forward in the sustainability realm, but understanding ingredients that have known environmental hazards needs to be the step one, the baseline. And the baseline for that is data. You've got to have the data behind it.
Yeah. And so in thinking about how to use a lot of these even our conversation here, right? This is a great educational piece for consumers that may have not considered, why ethoxylated ingredients are not permitted. How can we start to expand the conversation that we're having with consumers so that they understand, and I'm hoping care, right? How do we start to expose that lens of, the journey of a product from cradle to grave is really what you should be looking at, and not necessarily that end point of, well, I can put it in curbside recycling and it has a low reporting incidence of adverse event. How do we start to really have conversations with consumers about a lot of the issues that maybe are not at the forefront of conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something we contend with all the time, cross department, cross industry. There's going to be the certain consumer that just doesn't care. They're looking for lipstick. They need a toothpaste. They're too busy. And that's okay. I think that the industry needs to do better so that the consumer can feel confident that their product is safer and more sustainable. I don't feel that the problem is really in the consumer's hand. It's in the people who are creating and selling the products, which is why we're trying our best to do better and move the industry forward. So that includes, policy work and so many things under that hood. But the consumer, of course, is the one buying the product. So making sure, that the consumer understands the full life cycle of their product is important. When you look at the back of an ingredient list and you see a product that has, 30 ingredients, understand that all of those ingredients are coming from different locations around, our globe, and are potentially mined or harvested or associated with deforestation or, known to not biodegrade, all sorts of different aspects. So even though the product may be safe or safer for use with you, there are impacts. There are impacts, on others or on the environment. I get a lot of customer questions about naturals. They say, why are you using this synthetic ingredient? Why aren't you using natural? I want to see only ingredients that I can pronounce or that would be, in my lunch or dinner. And I think that is an unfortunate outcome of some of the clean beauty misinformation over the last 10 years.
It's a little bit of an oversimplification.
Exactly. Synthetics are not bad. Synthetics can be great. They can actually be more sustainable. They can have more data behind them. And getting that information out there to the consumer is really hard. I mean, contending with misinformation in general is really hard. But in the age of social media and this rampant spread of information is tough. So I think it's really on the people who are making the products and selling the products. So if there's ideas from listeners, please share.
Well, what comes to mind is really engagement early on with the cosmetic chemist when we start university, right? And having a requirement for toxicology as basic foundational element of education, to even, having discussions about where is this coming from and doing a life cycle analysis. I think, really getting in at the ground floor when we're talking about emerging cosmetic chemists so that in the future they're able to apply that knowledge would be very useful. In terms of transparency, what would you advise brands? Something I've encountered in, if I'm looking to get a full regulatory and safety dossier is sometimes companies will maybe not disclose a full manufacturing process. They consider it, trade secret or IP. And in that way, it prevents them from disclosing potentially really important information that would help me make a risk-based decision. And so what would you advise brands when they're looking to interact with raw material suppliers in terms of really obtaining documentation and getting the transparency that is needed to ensure that their products are safe?
Great question. We don't have any regulation around supply chain transparency in the US, so it can be a real headache. Like you said, raw material suppliers, sometimes we're held to what they will tell us, or, and we don't even know the right questions to ask without getting, the full story. So ethoxylated ingredients is a perfect example of that. Many raw material suppliers will not disclose their manufacturing practice. So an ingredient may be, there can be two ways to synthesize the ingredient, let's say, and one is an ethoxylated process and one is not, and the end ingredient is the same, but the raw material supplier will not disclose whether that's ethoxylated or not. They're not going to tell you kind of how they're making the ingredient. They're not going to share that recipe, which is unfortunate. I totally understand the IP aspect. So in that situation, we typically ask for letterhead documentation that says this ingredient is not made through X process, or even with fragrance, there's there's a real lack of transparency in fragrance in our industry as well. So we'll ask for letterhead documentation that says, this raw material supplier attests that there's no ingredients on the dirty list, or so to speak. You can do final product testing too. The more people that ask over the long haul, the better we will all do. In the last 10 years, I've seen a lot of change and a lot more open discourse between raw material suppliers and the industry because they're used to these questions now. They have the letterhead documentation. But you've really got to trust your raw material suppliers too, and really your supply chain up and down, and be diligent about developing those relationships over the long term. There are great suppliers and there's not so great suppliers. And if you're trying to get a source of truth, you really want to trust the people that you're working with. And that can be hard in a global economy where your raw material supplier isn't, based where you are. You've never met them in person, but it's important to develop that relationship. And when if a red flag has been raised, or you are, concerned, say this letterhead documentation doesn't look right, or it came too fast, I don't trust it, digging into that a little bit more. And we do that quite a bit, helping brands and also in Credo third-party brands too. We also, one thing I'd like to say too is when creating a formulation, in terms of what we were talking about earlier in sustainability, when you're getting a formulation created by your cosmetic chemist or contract manufacturer, it's important to ask why each of those ingredients are added to the recipe of the product, so to speak. I've started to see a trend of just a lot of ingredients added to bolster an ingredient list. And I would like to see some more simplification there. We don't need every botanical or every ingredient in a product. There really should be a purpose, because there's a real environmental harm when creating any of these ingredients. So less is more.
Yeah, and I think we've had a little bit of offline discussion about the power of the contract manufacturer. Sometimes it could be we have a pretty high minimum order quantity of this material and we have to get rid of it, right? So it then goes into your product. And I think an important part of also working with contract manufacturers is to understand what they require of their raw material vendors. What is the documentation that you guys maintain? How frequently are you requesting these? If the raw material make changes to their source or their process, do they have to disclose that to you, and how do you ensure that? So I think there is really a joint effort in really having oversight of your contract manufacturer and understanding the degree of oversight that they have over.
Absolutely. And having mutual NDAs and being able to understand and have the conversation where all the stakeholders are in the room is certainly important. It can become very difficult, particularly for the small brands who don't own their formulations. The contract manufacturer owns them, for them to really feel like they're a voice in the room. But asking the questions and having, working with retailers like Credo that can help those move those conversations along. And if they're not going anywhere, tell you, the suppliers or manufacturers that we're working with. We're an open book to our brands. And I think the dollars speak, right? Let's all put our money towards those who are sharing, disclosing, and willing to have the conversations.
Well, great. So we're coming up on time, but something new that I've wanted to ask guests on the episodes is really, what are some areas that you're really interested in exploring that you'd like to hear more about?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a public health professional focused on toxicology. So the ingredient aspect, the safety assessments, is something that I've been working closely with for a long time. We've talked a lot about sustainability here today. It's a very interesting topic, and everyone needs to know more about this topic, even the sustainability experts themselves?
Yeah, I mean, a long time ago, I had the opportunity to tour a recycling facility and learned a lot in regards to what they did and did not take, which I had no idea existed and was kind of concerned, like, why is this not disclosed
Yeah.
to the general public or people, at least in this municipality? Because I am operating under this, well, I'm doing my good deed. I am putting everything out to recycling. And little did I know that, only 30% of it was being accepted. So,
Yes. Yeah, and there's some California legislation that was recently passed about that. Not saying that something's recyclable unless you know for certain that 60% or more will be accepted by the facility. So anything in the sustainability realm in cosmetics or consumer products in general, I think, is not only what the consumer is interested in, but also what the industry is interested in, how we can do better and move the needle there. I would like to see that both from an ingredient standpoint, from a packaging standpoint, carbon emissions, scoping emissions. We're working on all of that at Credo. We co-founded 3 years ago Pact Collective, which is a collection program to deal with those beauty empties that are smaller than a yogurt cup. So we collect those back, and if they can be recycled, we take them, and we work with the facilities that will take those smaller. But, we would like to put Pact out of business one day. We would like this not to be a problem. So how we can do better there. And, similar in relationship is ingredient sustainability from sourcing. So there's many ingredients that really are lacking alternatives right now that are highly linked to deforestation or other environmental harms. And I would like to see more of that discussion. I think consumers are really concerned about the end use and their safety of the goop that they're putting on their face. I would like consumers and the discourse to be really around safety for all.
Yeah. And going back to that, the part about how resource intensive some ingredients are, that is a huge area for chemical companies to be exploring. Very lucrative, right? To be the first to be able to replace something that is so resource demanding. Yep. So it'd be really interesting to kind of have that list and discuss and kind of put it out as a call to arms. It was like an innovation challenge where it's like, here are the 5 most here are the 5 most problematic ingredients that do not have adequate replacements. Go.
Exactly. And again, that's why our dirty list, can only go so far. I would like to push it farther, but there aren't alternatives yet. So therefore the product couldn't be made. I mean, truly, our hands are tied in that respect. So I'm all about that. I will get the list of 5 to whoever is interested. Maybe this needs to be another collaborative or consortium, but I am seeing increased EU legislation, particularly around their deforestation policies. So hopefully, again, with policy comes change. So we have our own retailer policies, but we need, in order to really move the needle, it needs to be legislation at a U.S. level.
And separately, we may cut this out, but why is it that the EU is so much more advanced or in line with the conversation we're having in terms of oversight, in terms of forward-thinking legislation? How is it that they've gotten there? I don't know if it is something in terms of consumer demand that, they've demanded this. What is that difference that we're seeing between the EU and the US that is so vastly, so far apart?
So far apart. There's a few things. They're further ahead in cosmetics for many reasons. They have many more publicly, I'm not going to say many more. They have publicly available data. They have the REACH program. They have ECHA, which really helps because people are having the same conversations with the same information available. But just in general, the mindset of the EU is based on precaution, right? The precautionary principle. So until something is proven to be okay or be safer or more sustainable, they typically are tiptoeing in. Versus the U.S. doesn't need pre-market approval. We're kind of innocent until proven guilty, which has certainly harmed us as a society in many ways. PFAS is the perfect example, right? Yep. It solved a lot of problems, but now that the data is coming out that it's a persistent bioaccumulative and toxic, it's problematic, and we need to get out of using PFAS. We need to turn off the taps and work to clean up the problem that we've caused. So I think just the mindset of the EU being more precautionary and their legislation being geared towards that is how a lot of this has happened. I will say about the sustainability regulations, I'm not an expert in that realm, but they've done a lot with the Green Deal and the deforestation policies more so than the US. I don't know why that is, but I am seeing it create a lot more innovation, particularly around palm oil. I'd love to see it create some more innovation around mica. Again, I'm not pretending that beauty getting out of palm oil or mica solves the problem. I mean, the car industry is, using mica many folds more than the beauty industry. Or even saying that beauty getting out of its oxidant chemistries is going to solve the problem. But I believe that everyone should use a lipstick and just use it for what it is and not feel that there's guilt to be had for it, versus there's other industries that, medical sterilization, where you got to have it to be safe from misuse. So.
Okay. So in terms of wrapping up, where can we learn more about the Credo Clean Standard, and where are your retail locations?
Yeah. So we have retail locations in California, New York, Texas, Washington, Chicago. I should know the exact number. I think it's 14 or 15 stores now. And we are online. All of our stores, locations are online. We have a great presence on social media. I pop up there every now and then trying to share information. Marketing is telling me they want me, more to discuss more of these topics for consumers. So keep an eye out.
We can link. Yeah, we can link this there.
Keep an eye out. Exactly. And then I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. So for any professional work, please connect with me there. I did remember what I was going to say about the EU precautionary principle. I wouldn't say it's perfect. So in the EU, they are pretty cautious around genetically modified organisms, both in a cosmetic standpoint and a food. And there's a lot of data showing the importance of that technology. So it does also dampen innovation. So it's a push-pull approach. I don't think it's great to be 100% EU. It's certainly not great to be 100% US. We need to be working together, which is great in, this modern day where we are, I am able to talk with people in the EU, and the industries in general are able to collaborate more. But I would love to see the policies be informed more by each other as well.
Well, great. Thank you very much. This is very insightful, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.